We've got a bonus today. We have a speaker and her husband. They're both Joan's going to tell the stories and John's going to answer some questions. For almost 50 years, Joan Donaldson and John Van Voorhees have grown organic blueberries, boiled maple syrup, produced solar energy, and nurtured the soil at Pleasant Hill Farm. They received degrees in geology from Hope College, and Joan earned a master's in fine art with a concentration in creative nonfiction from Spalding University. She is the author of 6 books, and the BBC interviewed Joan about her latest historical novel, A Fond Kiss, as part of their soul music podcast that focused on the Robert Burns song. For over a dozen years, Joan facilitated writing workshops at the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference, sponsored by the University of North Texas, and the Christian Science Monitor published many of her agrarian essays. During the summer, she manages the farm's blueberry U-Pick operation and works on the blueberry packing line, along with preserving a large kitchen garden. In 1987, at the Michigan State Fair, Joan was crowned as the Homemaker of the Year. When not farming, writing, she volunteers as a peer mentor with TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Military Survivors. After reading Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture, Joan and John converted their family's fruit farm to organic methods. Joan will describe the evolution of Pleasant Hill Farm from the Back to the Land movement of the 1970s to the present emphasis on regenerative agriculture. Because Pleasant Hill is one of the oldest organic blueberry farms in the state, Michigan State University runs research projects on the land, and over the years, the farm has also hosted summer apprentices. In 1982, John positioned a solar panel on the roof of their timber-framed home, and the farm began producing solar energy. Today, it sells electricity to consumers' power. Whether training oxen, planting miles of hedgerows, or welcoming U-pickers and plein-air painters, Pleasant Hill Farm works to nurture a relationship between the farmers, their customers, and the land. The farm is most famous for the 4-acre poppy field planted each year in memory of their late son, who died in service for his country. I think that is my introduction. We're thrilled to have you here, Joan.
Thank you. Well, and thank you, Susan. Thank you, all of you, for coming. And thankful to the people who are sitting at home watching this too. And that was a really special introduction. We start keeping all that stuff on and they're like, oh, I did all that, didn't I? So, as you can see, this is 50 years across Pleasant Hill Farm. And we do have a Pleasant Hill on our farm, actually, but it was also named after Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, if any of you are familiar with the Shaker history of that area. So I wanted to do a little bit of backstory to begin with. These are the first 2 people who settled the land in 1837, James McCormick and his wife. And he and 2 other farmers in the area, they experimented with planting fruit. They saw the men down by Benton Harbor were planting peach orchards. So they planted peach orchards. And at one point, from about Holland down to the border, it was mostly peaches. So that's John's parents' house. His parents are now deceased, but he grew up in that house at the bottom. Max Landing, some of you, if you're local, you might recognize that name. We have a Max Landing veterinary clinic, and certain other things are sometimes named as Max Landing. Mac McCormick would drive his team of his wagon and his horses across the country to Max Landing on the Kalamazoo River. And this is the great estuary there. And then load up the peaches on a boat or a barge that went down to the mouth of the Saugatuck Harbor. And if I remember correctly, there were about 3 schooners a day that went to Chicago. And you're going to hear Chicago at other points in time in this lecture, because Chicago has always been a place that there's a relationship with marketing and transportation. So John's grandparents bought the farm from Ashley McCormick's daughter in about 1937. And they looked around, and the neighbors they saw had just planted some blueberries. And his parents also ran a fruit stand that some of you might recognize. I don't know. It's not in business anymore. So his grandparents decided that they would grow blueberries. And they started planting them around the very late 30s, early 40s, he and his sons. And blueberries, again, that was a new crop at that time. I mean, that's another whole like lecture of how they got into it, agriculture in Michigan. So they planted the blueberries and then they started harvesting and selling them. During those years, John's parents, of course, they were using the products that they had. And they were more petrochemicals coming on the scene. And like most other people, they saw these products as really like miracles. You could really zap those bugs with DDT. But people also were beginning to ask questions when you get into like the late 60s and 70s. But anyways, that's what everybody did. And that I'm not in any way judging. I'm just saying that was how he grew up, is what everybody else was doing. And of course, when you're a farmer, you're battling a constant, you're battling the weather, you're battling bugs and birds, and I can go on and on about that. So that was how he grew up. And then he met me. I grew up north of Detroit, in Mount Clemens, which is a small city at that point. It was not part of the big strip between Mount Clemens and Detroit that there is now. But I had roots over here. My mother grew up in Pawpaw, and my grandfather had a fruit farm. He was a retired fruit farmer, but my uncle had a fruit farm. So I was, learning things about farming by just running through the orchards, thinking this is a great place to live. But I also found this book, and it came out in 1970. It was called Living on the Earth. And I really enjoyed her drawings and her like simple ways of living when growing things. She was putting out organic ideas. This book actually was a smash hit by Alicia Baylor. And I just found out recently that there was a 50th anniversary, because I wrote her and I said, I bought your book in 1971 and it really influenced me. And she said, I cried when I read that. Can I put that down as a testimony? I said, yes, you can. So that was a really important book there are other people doing this. And that's what I think I'd like to do. So John and I married 50 years ago. And as a friend next door, he gave us some organic gardening. At that point, it was organic gardening and farming magazines. And there were a whole host of new ideas that neither of us had ever read about, because we hadn't had our fingers on those kinds of information. So we started thinking maybe there's a better way, and maybe we should consider a better way than what John grew up with, and even really what my uncle was doing on his farm. And of course, this is like just at the beginning of the Back to the Land movement. So we read those magazines, and then we joined the Rodale Book Club. And one of the first books we got was this book here, The Unsettling of America and Agriculture and Culture by Wendell Berry. And for the first time, a writer showed how industrial farming was influencing our culture, our way of looking at the land, and then each other, the way we treated each other. Berry emphasized that we should not view land as a commodity to utilize for profit, but that the farmer and the land should live in community. And really, I would put in there that also the customer is in community. And that's something that I've seen. It used to be 50 years ago when we did U-Pick, people came for a less expensive fruit, basically. And then they sort of faded away. Now it's a relationship. They want a relationship with their farmer. And I mean, I think that's a good thing in the long run, because as I will talk about relationships, it's accountability too. And Barry also pointed out that historically American settlers, they farmed a piece of land, and when it could no longer yield you a major crop, you moved on. And Barry spoke against using chemical fertilizer just for monetary gain. Like you're getting a good crop this year, but what are you doing to the soil? And so he was pushing people towards a more like organic, or what we would today say regenerative agriculture. A good documentary about Barry is Look and See. He's still living. I don't think he writes as much as he used to. He's written poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. And there he is. And I like this quote. As I see it, the farmer standing in his field is not isolated as simply a component of a production machine. He stands where lots of lines cross, cultural lines. And I think he was one of the first people to bring this forth. Of a traditional farmer, that is the farmer who was first independent, who first fed himself off his farm, and then fed other people, who farmed with his family, and who passed the land on down to people who knew it and who had the best reasons to take care of it. That farmer stood at the convergence of traditional values and our modern values, basically. So Barry's, I had the immense pleasure of meeting him when I was at Spalding. He came to a poetry reading. And one of my young friends said, Mr. Barry's here. And I said, I would love to meet him. And so she took me over and introduced me. And then I told him, we read that book of yours. And I said, that book changed our lives and really the direction of our farm. And I just remember in that soft Kentucky voice, he said, I hope I didn't steer you wrong. I said, no, you didn't. I'm really thankful for that book. And so, and then we in 2015 went down with a group of young farmers who wanted us along, even though we weren't young farmers, and spent a day with Wendell Berry. And that was a really amazing time too. So here we are. We decided we wanted to do a more organic, back to the land kind of farm. But what do we do? Who's going to show us what to do? There's no internet at this point. So, that was probably a dream come true for many people now that are into farming. So we decided, somebody told us about, oh yeah, I cannot remember who told us, but Maynard and Sally Kaufman, along with John and Judy Yeager, created Organic Growers of Michigan in 1973. John and Judy both had PhDs from the University of Chicago, and they were teaching in Chicago, but they wanted out of the city. So they bought a farm. They stayed and paid it off and then started a vegetable. She had 13 acres of vegetables. Maynard, on the other hand, he'd grown up on a farm. So had John Yeager, actually. But he came to Western Michigan to teach in the religion department. And he began running a small diversified farm near Bangor. They were really visionaries. They saw a need. And they saw the back to the land people coming and not knowing what they were doing. And so they decided that they were going to form this cooperative. And they were going to emphasize purchasing together, like fertilizer, seed. I remember buying seed with them. And then certification. John Yeager was the one who really said this is going to be important someday. And then education, because like I said, most of us didn't know what we were doing. And then marketing, which has always been a challenge. Let's put it that way. There's Maynard. And then eventually Maynard created an interdisciplinary department of the Religion and Environmental Studies at Western. And later in life, he founded the Michigan Organic Food and Farm Alliance. And actually Maynard just died like 2.5 years ago, I think it was. So he was a very important voice for the whole movement of organic agriculture in Michigan. And then a couple of years ago, he wrote this book, if anybody really wants to know more about the organic movement in Michigan. And it outlines, like John's in there, and most of the people from the original chapter of the Southwest Michigan Organic Growers. And John and I thought there were 4, but I was listening to, there's actually a little movie about organic growers, and Maynard said there were at one time about 10 chapters because there were some in the UP. We never met any of those people, but so it was a very dynamic group of people. And that's one of the things that I think was so exciting. I didn't realize it, but Judy also said it had a remarkable number of PhDs and was a very well-educated group of people too. So they were really fun meetings. We met once a month in Decatur. And then eventually John and I also served on the executive board. So we met like every other month or something to talk about what programs we should have. What are we doing about certification? But one of the big topics that I always remember was soil. And this is something that when you look at regenerative agriculture, they're always going to talk about the soil. One of the big difference when John and I were discussing this is that certain things that we know today, we didn't know back then. We just knew like the key to healthy food was going to be in the soil. So that we were always discussing like, what are good cover crops? Should we have a chisel plow? Should we have this kind of plow? Should we do no-till? These were all topics that we discussed amongst each other because we had that common goal of wanting really good soil. We learned about slow release fertilizers. Most distributors only sold in small bags. And so as a co-op, remember, one of our things was we were going to purchase together. And so they started buying fertilizers by the carload, by the train carload. And then we would all, they all came in on like a Thursday and everybody meet down there on a Friday and unload the cars together. Yeah. We have to also remember a lot of these people are in their 20s and 30s. There was one family, Bill and Marie Munt, they had a farm down, I think, around Decatur again. And they had been farming organically for many years. And sort of where we are now, MSU would go to their farms and do bug sweeps and see what they had in their farm for bugs. And we've had that happen too. So some of these things farmers still use as far as like copper on for fungus, and then the slow release fertilizers like rock phosphate. So here's just a couple examples. I remember unloading bags of these. Green sand comes from glauconite, a mineral deposit in shallow marine environment. It provides slow release potassium, iron, and other trace minerals. And we've become, over the years, people now have a better idea of what those trace minerals are good for. And then another one was rock phosphate, and it increases the soil ability to capture carbon, and it's less expensive than the chemical forms of it. It also helps plants develop strong roots. And I was going to throw this out here about soil and dirt. Years ago, a friend hung a sign over his shed and it says, "When you work in dirt, you won't get hurt." I'm like, Farming is one of the top 10 most dangerous occupations. I mean, I can remember John coming home and go, "Well, I almost rolled a caterpillar over me today." I'm like, I don't want to hear things like that. I really don't. So it is a very dangerous for that reason. You got big tractors and heavy equipment. And so, but the sign was right. Dirt is really important. So, it's always been one of our big goals, because we all knew that farmers understood even back then that healthy soils grow healthy plants that resist diseases and pests to some degree, and that we'll have healthier food for healthier people. And also, when I was listening to this little film with Judy Yeager and Maynard, he said there were 3 reasons people seem to come to organic growers. The most common one was for that education. And they went into organic farming for the environmental reasons, that they wanted to do what they could to create soil and to not harm the planet. And like John and Judy Yeager said, that was one of their main reasons. And then it was for health purposes. And I can think of several farmers that, and even we had customers from very far away. I remember going to the airport and shipping out blueberries to somebody who could only eat like 4 things, and one was organic blueberries. So this is before we were shipping them through the internet. This was years ago. So there were people who needed it for health reasons. And then the last one Maynard said, and John and I looked at each other and said, I don't remember anybody for that, was that they thought they would make more money because you could, add a niche value to it. And he said, those people didn't last very long. And I thought, yeah, that's probably true. That's why I didn't know anybody. I mean, most of us were just starting and we didn't have a lot of money, and some people had very young families. And so we were all just supporting each other. Besides Wendell Berry's writings, we also read Louis Bromfield. Some of you may have read some of his books. He was an organic farmer and an author who also wrote quite a few novels. Some were made into movies. And he promoted cover crops for building soil, planting hedgerows for beneficial insects. So John and I, of course, were getting all the information we could from organic growers and other friends, but we decided to make ourselves a little organic farm tour. So we went off to Malabar Farm, which is now a state park. It's in Lucas, Ohio. It wasn't too far away. And we could see they were still practicing sustainable and organic methods there. So he did livestock and grains, the cover crops. Today, it's, like I said, it's a state park. They still maintain it as a farm. You can tour it. And then they do other things along the line, like making maple sugaring. So, I mean, if you ever wanted to go to a really pretty place, that's a beautiful farm. I have friends who just went down there because they like that area of Ohio and visited it. And then another place that I don't know if any of you ever used it was Walnut Acres. And they were out closer to Lancaster. They bought their farm in 1946, and they became the first organic food company that you could order through the mail. And I don't remember where we first heard about them. I assume there was maybe like an ad in organic gardening, And then we sent away, and the only thing I remember buying is peanut butter. But with the day we were there, we could watch and go through their fields and see how they were rotating things and what they were doing for weed control. And then we went into the plant and saw them. At that day, they were packing squash, I remember. Farmers only travel in the fall and the winter. So we were out there like sometime in late October. And I never realized at that point that one day we would be turning into an internet food source for people, because now we ship berries from about Denver to the East Coast. We can't go much farther in 3 days. So when I was putting this together, I thought, man, I never thought I was going to do that. But there we were. And then Rodale, they're the people that were publishing organic gardening and farming. We went to their new place, which was just started. I think it was their very first year when we were there. And so we saw what they were doing. And I remember John talking to them about fruit farming, because they were just starting to plant some apples. And mostly they knew more about like vegetable crops and grains. So he gave a few hints, being a kid that grew up on a fruit farm. So we did our own little thing. John also would read a magazine. Well, yeah, now it's a magazine. It used to be a newspaper called Acres USA. And then organic farming and gardening split, and they had the new farm. Wendell Berry wrote a lot of articles for that one. And about that time, we found out that he was also a poet. And so those were like two of the main magazines, periodicals that we had. And Acres also put on a conference every year. And John went to that for quite a few years, where they would bring in speakers about different topics about organic and regenerative farming now. And they also did, later on, they started doing workshops too, so that you could take workshops. I remember subscribing to Mother Earth News. That was really more for gardeners. And then the Small Farmers Journal, which was a really good journal, but again, it was more for a very small homesteading farm. So along the line, John started reading all these articles, and he decided to make compost tea. And so he's also changed what he does. But the very first one, we started trying to find an aerator. We went to a pet store, and the aerators for fish tanks were not big enough. So he had to cobble this thing together. He got a fiberglass tub. He put in 500 gallons of our water from our pond, baking yeast and molasses, and then it bubbled and bubbled. And he would aerate it some more. And about 3 or 4 days later, he sprayed it on the ground and on the plants. And that was a beginning of a process. Over the years, it's changed. I remember he had one thing that reminded me of Tom Terrific that was on the top of this tank. And then just in the last couple of years, he had a heating element that went in the tank, because he could start creating compost tea earlier in the spring that way. He still does it, but sometimes now he buys it like dehydrated compost, because there's a big bin of it out in the barn that he and our son was tapping into. So I tapped into it too. So anyways, we took 6 acres of his family farm, and we converted it into an organic system. And that was one of the things he did to replenish the soil and the plants. But he also, one of our neighbors gave him an old spray manual from like the 1930s. Because we're like, what are we going to do about bugs, And that had a recipe for using rotenone to kill insects, and that's a ground up plant root. So we did that for quite a while. So that's what we're doing there. But like you said, accountability is really important. And we found that, people were asking us, what are you doing? Are you putting manure on everything? Is that what it means to be organic? Or are you doing this? I used to go to the farmer's market for the first couple of years, and I was trying to explain to people what we were doing. And that's when OGM started to discuss in-depth certification. So we recognized at that point, this would be like late 70s, almost 1980, that certification was going to become very important one day. And it was John Yeager who kept saying that. So we knew that if we had certification, we would list our standards. When you sold something, you could say, well, we don't use these products, but we do use these products. So as a group, we just hashed out ideas. What about this? What about that? Or you could use antibiotics for the first 30 days with an animal, but then you couldn't use it. Or if you used antibiotics on animals, say they had a cow with mastitis, then you had to, dump the milk for 30, 40 days. So the farmers, it just was a constant discussion. What are we going to do? And of course, nowadays you don't use GMOs, of course. So they were discussing all these different things about what we could use, what we couldn't use, to the best of our knowledge at that time. So that's why I say relationships matter. And so we knew each other because we were on like a certain really a fellowship of people that saw each other, went to each other's houses for dinner, went to potlucks. So we wrote out our standards. What we were going to have is, and then the state standards were, OGM was sort of, the Southwest chapter was like the brain sending things out. And so people had to write out again, soil, because soil is so important. What are you doing to encourage the maintenance of your soil and improving it? And then the big difference, let's see, the very first state to have standards and certification was California. I always thought Oregon was second. John did too, but then in this film, Maynard goes, well, we might have been second and they were third, or vice versa. So we were like in the top three. So how are you going to, uphold these standards? We looked at each other and said, we'll certify each other. So we did. We rotated between farms and we knew each other and we knew we could trust each other. And as John said, it did look a little odd when we signed our certificate because we were certification managers one year. But, I remember friends going out to the New England Organic Farming Conference. And then when they told them what we were doing, they were just astounded. They just couldn't believe it, But it's like, it worked. It worked because we had those relationships and we all knew what we were doing to our farms, basically. There's a copy of our most recent certificate. So one thing that happened in the years that followed is that they knew that we were going to have national standards. So in 1989, John was like, Maynard said, John, why don't you go to this conference? Because it was close to where the Acres conference was. And he went as a delegate from Michigan with these other delegates from other states and that had growers, like organic growers. And they hashed out, what should we tell the federal government as far as standards that we think they should have? And of course, they evolve. Like we used rotenone. At some point, they said, you may no longer use this. You're going to have to use a different product. And so things that you could use one year, maybe 5 years down the road, you couldn't. You had to use a new set of standards, basically. So John did that. And then I remember just last night, then he was a delegate to the Michigan State, agriculture department. They had put together, how are we going to do this for the state of Michigan? So he was the delegate from OGM again to go and talk to them and to put some input on what we're doing. And then now the National Organic Standard Boards, they meet. There are a couple farmers every year. They rotate people, but there are farmers on there to say, this is what I do as a soybean farmer. This is what I do as a hog farmer or a fruit farmer. And they create the standards. And now we are certified, as it says here, we had Oregon until for many years because we could then sell our food internationally, and we were selling juice berries to Canada. Now we work with a local person, he's down in Indiana, called Unmarked. He used to certify for tilth, so he is putting those things together. So I always display my certificate. Plus, like we said, we realize that purchasers are going to want it. And so, we've sold over the years to large companies and to even small people. And then I put it out for my UPIC people so that they can see, yes, I'm a certified farm. If you want to know more, you can go on the web, look at the standards and see what they said is what we are allowed to do this year or can't do. And know that certification is very expensive. Because if you are like a vegetable grower, you're going to have to certify every vegetable, cucumbers, tomatoes, green beans, peppers, whatever. We just grow blueberries. And so they're one big crop in one big field. And therefore we only have to have that one field certified compared to if I was doing, cherries and plums and whatever, and every crop would have to be certified then. So some people can't afford it. I can think of friends who can't afford it, but they are organic farmers. They just have, again, that relationship with their customers. If any of you have ever bought anything from a Green Wagon at the farmer's market here, and then they're at the Grand Rapids Farmers Market too. I mean, they're organic farmers, but I know, and they may be certified now, but I know at the beginning they couldn't afford it. They just said, they have farm days, people can come out and see what we're doing, they can talk to me. So in that sense, that is a problem for very beginning farmers. And there aren't enough young farmers. I mean, you probably know and read that. And years ago, the Michigan State Organic Department, they had a field trip on our farm. And I remember, when John was talking to everybody, and he said to this group of people, most of them were young farmers, they were in their 20s. How many of you want to be a fruit farmer? And there was one person who raised their hand. It was a lady who had just retired and bought a small fruit farm. And we're like, nobody wants to be a fruit farmer. Okay. And then Matt Grisham explained to me that, they're young, they can't afford land. They can rent a piece of land. They can grow vegetables on it. So you just buy the seed and then you get a profit that year. You make just enough money to rent land, to buy more seed, but they can't get into buying land. I mean, John can probably tell you, I can't remember the numbers in California. What is it, like $100,000 just to rent 10 acres of land? The purchase prices are out of this world. That's why with strawberries, they just plant them for 1 year instead of using them for 2. So being a young farmer is, that's one of the things we need to think about as a society. How can we encourage young farmers? Like I said, here's the national standards, and they are still there today. Interns, or GM said, one of the things we want to do was educate. So as young farmers, here we are, 6 acres and hardly any money. How are we going to get the work done? From our discussions at OGM, and then we were reading the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners newsletter at that point, we learned about hosting summer interns. And so we said, well, we could do that. So I don't know how many of you know Sojourners Magazine, but they used to have like a message board at the back of it. We thought, if people are reading Sojourners, they're probably going to be somewhat like-minded. So we put notices in, and over the years, we had interns from Minnesota, New York City, California, from the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada. They did everything that you do on an organic farm. They were weeding blueberry bushes. They were helping bale hay. They helped with packing blueberries, picking blueberries. Sometimes they went to, I remember once, farmer's market with me, and then of course the U-Pick. So they were involved in all the things that they could learn from us, basically. We gave them a small stipend. We fed them. One summer we had five interns. That was a lot of people to feed. Considering I did all my cooking on a wood cook stove too. So, because for the first couple of years we didn't have any electricity until we put up those solar panels. So they learned about those kinds of things too. And in 85, we were raising a barn, so they got to learn some timber framing. Most of them did not go on to be farmers, except for our friends Patty and Michael, who they bought a farm. It was about a little more than an hour east of Minneapolis. They were from Minneapolis. And they bought a farm in Wisconsin just over the border. And they created a very successful CSA, community supported agriculture. And it's still existing. They have retired, but it's now a cooperative. So people are coming and working the farm, and they volunteer there, but they said, we no longer have to run it, basically. So, and what for us, a lot of people came because of Lake Michigan. At the end of the day, you go jump on the lake, which we all did together. And then in 1986, we adopted 2 very young interns. And we adopted a sibling group from Colombia, South America. And at that point, that's the day they got naturalized. We said, we're going to concentrate on just being parents at this point. I remember Sally Coffin saying, oh, but it's so much fun to see them playing with the interns. I'm like, I'm speaking Spanish and I'm awake all night long because these kids were traumatized. They had been living on the streets. And so, we had a lot to deal with. I'm like, I'm going to focus on this right now. So they were our interns for several years. But then, your kids grow up, they go off to school. And a friend's college-age daughter said, I would like to intern on your farm. And I went, yeah, we could do this again now. And she brought a friend along with her. And again, we did by that point have a place that they could live by themselves, so they didn't have to live with us. And they did everything we did. They worked on the blueberry shaker. They didn't drive it. They probably got a little chance to try it. They did baling. Hey, they wanted to train goats. So we said, okay, you can train goats if you want. They were a lot of fun. And so that was, it was a good revival to bring them back and to have them there at the farm. And Joe Saladin, who spoke at Hope quite a few years ago, He wrote an article, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago about the number one crop we need is young farmers. Where are the farmers? You know, we need to be training young people. We need more young people on our farms. And there we did it. We brought them along. Now, a common question is, what do you do about bugs? And, you know, that, like I said, we used rotenone for a while, but for a long time, we only really had one pest. It was blueberry maggot. And that's a fly that, you know, lays their eggs in the blueberries and you get little white worms. And so John would put out traps and that trapped some of them, but also he would monitor the traps and then go, okay, peak emergence and go out and spray with rotenone. And that pretty much solved the problem. Sometimes he had to spray once more, but usually just one time during the peak emergence would take care of the blueberry maggot. And then came what we call SWD. It's a fruit fly. It's a spotted winged Drosophila, and it came in about 2009. And we knew it was coming. We knew it was on each side of the coast, and it was coming to the Midwest. And we knew it was finally there when we would see these clouds of this fruit fly coming up from the grass. And they also like to live in hedgerows. Not only goes after blueberries, raspberries, strawberries. Some people have seen it in cherries. And so we take a newsletter, most farmers do, where they were from the extension, and it would tell us where SWD just hashed out in Lawrence, you know, SWD just hashed out in Grand Junction. Also we monitor it now with traps. We have one product we can use. It's very expensive. You can only use a certain amount over the growing season, and you can only use it every so many days. So it's almost like a trap. What are we going to do? Here it is. So MSU again, we've worked on various projects, and Matt Grisham, who was head of the organic department, corralled John into being part of a study. He got a grant, and instead of each land grant university doing their own thing, I can't remember, John can tell you how many there were, but everybody took like an element of experimentation. Like, I'm going to do, where does it lay its eggs? You know, how does it do this? How does it do that? And everybody got together once a year, and then they would report on their research. That way they didn't duplicate each other's research, you know, like everybody's doing the same topic. They could help each other. And of course, I love relationships and accountability and community. And that, it helped to some degree, but it's still a major problem. A lot of farmers just gave up. I mean, that's what they did because it was just so expensive to try to farm. Not another little critter came along, and that's the gall wasp. Those are galls. This little wasp is active during blossom, and that's a problem right there. You don't want to spray any pesticides of any sort during blossom because you're going to kill your pollinators. But how do you kill this little critter that's coming and laying its eggs in the tip of the branches, and it cripples them? It puts out that little gall. There's only one method that we know of, and MSU has given John, and you can ask him more questions, certain sprays that supposedly don't hurt the pollinators that he's tried. I don't think they've been the most effective. So we pick them off by hand. And it's another reason a lot of people gave up, because these are like little rocks. And if you shake your blueberries off, these come off sometimes too. And unless you have a rock sorter on your line, they're going to come through your blueberry line. So another one of those things that's a tragedy for blueberry farmers, they just gave up. John has probably spent thousands of hours. I mean, people go, what do you do now? It's wintertime. I'm like, we're picking off galls and pruning blueberries, you know? So there, and you can't drop them on the ground. You know, that was like, I was picking off galls. I took a picture, and then you have to dispose of them, because if you drop it on the ground, then they're still going to hatch out and come out in the spring. But we have little friends that I notice, because I mean, one of the things I love about being an organic farm is we've noticed more and more birds over the years. And one time when I was out picking these off, I saw chickadees, goldfinches, downy woodpeckers, and hairy woodpeckers. These are like little condominiums. You can drill a little hole in the top if you're a finch and pull out the larvae. And these birds are doing that. That's how they were feeding that day. And so if you come along one of those, I still tick it off usually, but you know that they've already eaten the pests out of it. So if you don't want to, you don't have to. So, I mean, thank God for birds. We haven't found any other beneficial insects that I can think of. John might know something, but that's one that have witnessed. So I'm really thankful for birds. So that's one of our winter activities. Um, Pulling off galls doesn't sound too exciting, but I listen to podcasts when I do that because there aren't that many birds in the rest, in the springtime. And I listen to all the birds. And I don't know if you're familiar with the app Merlin, you can, yeah, I have a lot of fun with that out there. And I come home and say, I never knew there were natural warblers around here. Yeah, I enjoy that a lot. So there's a day's work. Pollinations. I thought, oh yeah, I better talk about pollination since we're here. We rent bees. A lot of people like, you rent bees? Yeah, well, they do, because there aren't enough wild pollinators anymore. And they come in on a flatbed truck. There's like 4 hives to a pallet. John's told the beekeepers where to put them. And so they're spaced around the blueberries. And even though I walk on the blueberries every day, I don't go by the beehives. When they come in, and they have a little tiny forklift so they can lift it off the flatbed and put them in those places. So when bees are there, they put up enough supers, they hope, so that the bees won't swarm. Because if the bees swarm, they split the hive, they leave, and they go somewhere else. Our sons were beekeepers when they were teenagers, and Carlos did it during college. I think he left it when he started graduate school. So now we call up Carlos or another friend from church and go, well, there's a bee swarm. Here's a swarm. They've left the hive and they've swarmed in a pine tree. And so we tell people, Joel or Carlos, come and get it. And there's a saying that you might have heard, a swarm in May is worth a load of hay. A swarm in June is worth a silver spoon. So Carlos comes down with his son, Ian. They smoke the swarm and then they drop it, or in this case, Ian was shaking the branch into a hive body. And that gives them a nice little home. That's what they're looking for, a new home. They're usually pretty calm because they're not protecting the home. It doesn't mean you never get stung. I mean, one of our jokes in the family was, well, did you get stung? And, they roll their eyes at you. And yeah, but here they are. I mean, I know Ian didn't get stung putting the hive. And there's one of our famous family stories that I've written about is Carlos was in college and he had just come home. He was checking his hives and I saw a swarm go over my garden. I'm like, okay, I better follow this. And then I'll tell Carlos where to go find it. It went to the window of his room, his bedroom, and knocked on this window. And then it started going up until that like overhang. We had a cantilevered roof. And I'm like, I don't believe this. So I said, Carlos, do something. I don't want bees in the house. And so he put a hive body up there with honey in it, thinking that they would go into it because that's what they normally do, but they didn't. He goes, well, I know something else we could do. And I go, like what? He goes, I need a paper bag and the mister you use when you're iron. I'm like, okay. He puts on his helmet and his bee gloves. And he said, I'm going to put him in a bag. I'm like, I don't believe this. He said, you man all the doors. So I opened the window. We had a skylight. He went out on the skylight, got on the roof. I closed the skylight and he misted this swarm and then took his hands and scooped up a big handful and put it in the bag. And he did that until there was hardly any bees left and this bag was getting pretty big. And then he nodded at me. I opened the skylight. He went through, and I closed that. He went through another door. He went down the stairs. I closed the door. So in case anything happened, we could contain them. And he ran out. He put it in, my son's like really laid back. He put it in a hive, a hive body. But he said, well, I put a piece of paper. It was a hive that was not real strong. It was sort of weak. So he put this piece of paper and then he put the hive body on it. And then he put the bees in that one. Because by the time they chew through that paper, they're all going to be friends. I'm like, I hope so. And it worked. And like I said, I wrote this story for the Christian Science Monitor and other places. And that's one of those stories that you just tell around your family. That the day the bees came looking for Carlos and he put them in a bag. And I said, how did you know to do this? I read it in a magazine. I'm like, yeah, that'd be you too, So anyways, he rescued the swarm. But what do? Well, then you have honey. And so this is like Saturday night on the farm. Our nephew now has hives on the farm too, along with a friend from church. And he is a Marine vet who served in Iraq. So he has PTSD. And there's a special program called Hives for Heroes. And they train you, they help you buy a hive. He's in Chicago, but he has a hive in Chicago, and then he helps Carlos with the hives on the farm. He had a hive here too. So here we all are. Everybody's, my grandson Ian, Denise is holding Sophia, and then Carlos and Chris are running the extractor. The kids are waiting for the honey. Like we told them to put your fingers in the extractor. And then they actually sold honey this year at their produce stand. Mowing, what do you do about weeds? Over the years, because again, for many, many years, there was no organic herbicides. There are a few things now that we're allowed to use. So John mowed, and we have a swing arm mower. As it says, somebody's driving the tractor. I think his sister was driving it that day. And he pushes that blade. He sits there and he pushes it in and out between every bush. It's very labor intensive. It takes about an hour to do an acre, and there's 40 acres. So it's a long process. And usually he does this about 3 times, sometimes 4 times a year. You want to do it in the spring, and you want to do it just before we do harvest, especially for you pickers. And then he'll do it in the fall, because if you get the weeds down, it's easier to go in and prune the blueberries during the winter. So there he is. There he's working. It's just another one of those really demanding jobs of farm work. When you have apprentices, you put them in the seat if you can. And then, one of us will drive. Marketing. Remember, one of the goals of OGM was marketing. So we worked with each other. That was a hard one because there wasn't enough produce. I learned last night that this one produce buyer that we sold to would come over here once a week and pick up produce at one person's location down in Lawrence. It was Paul and Mary Schultz's farm. And they pressed their apples and pears into juice and froze it and took it into Chicago. So they usually brought loads of our blueberries into Chicago. We drove a few in too, but they were really good about helping market other people's produce. And then just through word of mouth, there was a produce company in Milwaukee, Golden Produce. He would drive over and pick up our blueberries. And at that time, we had a peach orchard too. So he would buy peaches. And then there was Roots and Fruits in Minneapolis. And there was Rainbow Produce in Denver. Because I remember one of the semis turned over. We didn't get paid, but it was like, oh no. No. But the markets changed, partly because of the back to the land movement sort of started changing. So we started freezing all our blueberries. We still had U-Pick, which I'll show a couple photos, but we pack them in these 30-pound boxes and froze them. And then we started getting phone calls from various entities like Cascading Farms. They bought from us when they first went into production. And they asked John to come out and help them when they were planting their blueberries, but he didn't want to go. And then Earth's Best Baby Food, they came to us again because we were selling to Cascadian. And then there was a large food co-op called Ozark down in the Ozarks. And they sold to areas in that general vicinity all the way down to New Orleans. And what destroyed them was Katrina, because it knocked out the whole market in New Orleans. And that's when they went under, which is when, how we do it. Yeah, I should put the next one. This is our blueberry shaker. Most of you have probably seen a blueberry shaker, which is why I didn't go into a lot of detail. This is our new one. His parents had one when he was in his teens. We bought this one in 94. There he's driving. Carlos is on it with Ian, and his sister is picking up the lugs. There's like about 40 pounds on a lug, and then they stack those yellow boxes. And then when the shaker's full, you put them on a flatbed and bring them up to the big cooler we have. And that's what we do. We usually try to shake one day and pack the next day. And on the internet, and people started calling us and saying, we can't get your blueberries anymore. Ozark went out. We can't buy it from Azure Standard out in Oregon. We want your blueberries. So now what are we going to do? We thought about it. We talked to a friend, and we finally started experimenting. I remember we sent 5-pound boxes to John's relatives in Texas and Arizona, and they were all thawed when they showed up, even though we packed them in like a little cooler with ice. So then John talked to Pete Palazzolas. He does the gelato factory. And Pete said, oh, I use this type of styrofoam cooler. You can buy it from this place. So at the beginning, we bought with him. And then we started just with our own website. Then we moved into, it's called Barn to Door. And now we're with Eat from Farms. And these are different software sites where they help you set up an internet shop. And you can go to that site. You can either order to have it shipped to you from September through May, Or lots of people even like to use it because they'd rather pay with a credit card and then they come down to the farm and just pick up a box. And people just call us too, or email us or text us and say, can I stop by tomorrow at 4 o'clock? Yeah. And through the internet, we do 30 pounds and 10 pounds. On the farms, it's 30s, 10s, and 5s. The 5s, like I said, they won't make it. But to me, it's a marvel that people in New York City, downtown New York City, will buy 30 pounds of blueberries. And yet my best customer, he buys a box a month and he's in Ann Arbor. And I told him once, you're my best customer. What are you doing with these? He goes, my daughter eats a pound a day. Thank God for that daughter, you know? Here's John putting together an order. It's every Wednesday. And we ship with FedEx. So here's the box, the big box. It's got the cooler in it. We tried a greener cooler because we really didn't like using all that styrofoam. And some of our customers were complaining, but it was a fiasco. It just, things melted more than we wanted. It's like that won't work, except for maybe in the depths of winter. So we had to go back to what we were doing. And FedEx comes to the farm and picks up the boxes. We get a lot of trust there. And then, they wind their way to wherever they're going. This week they're going to Pennsylvania, North Carolina. And I just got another one from Michigan. And we have a lot of repeat people, but then they tell people, and lots of people send them for Christmas presents and stuff like that. Now we've also just signed on with Seal the Seasons, and they're putting them in 2-pound bags. And they are from North Carolina, but they do little regions. So like they will only sell our blueberries in the Midwest. And then they will sell like New Jersey's berries in New Jersey. So locally, we sell the Nature's Market and Harvest Health. So that's something new. I know they said they were trying to get in all the Nash Spartan stores. And I don't know where else they're going to be. We just started in with them last fall. So they are packing berries and sending them out. U-pick, we've always done some U-pick. It was more profitable in some ways in the years past. Because like I said, there was a major recession when we got out of college in 75. My sister-in-law reminded me, there was a 13% inflation and 13% unemployment. I'm like, yeah, that's right, So we did U-pick, and then we were doing fresh packs. So people were coming, and we paid them to pick. What I like now is that there are families who bring their grandchildren, and that's really fun for me. That people have been coming to the farm for so many years that their grandchildren, pretty soon, some may be bringing great-grandchildren. We usually do it from mid-July to about early August. And we have gone to Sign Up Genius because during COVID, they gave us a lot of ideas of what to do, and that was one. So we could just space out the number of people. Oh, I lost it. Okay. How's this regenerative? Well, like I said, at the beginning, we didn't even know what that word was. We just knew we had to work with the dirt. Now, we started in on the compost tea. Now we're talking, you get the microbes, you got the bacteria. He's putting that all in and the fungus. So that would be something that they would talk about in regenerative agriculture. They also encourage permaculture, which that's what we have. If we don't have that grass between our rows, our equipment would sink because it's a peat bog. And there was a very large caterpillar I saw sinking once. So that's something we think about. You want that root mass so that the equipment can stay up. So, and we also have about 100 acres of woods on the farm. They're not all in one big clump, even though there is a big woods, we call it the big woods. And then the orchards, you have all these trees that are taking in CO2 and giving out oxygen. Environmental engineers. Here's one of those things, like I love them. John can't stand them. Beavers moved in about 7 years ago. In fact, just on the way here, I said, oh yeah, they knocked down another tree on the path by the back farm. It's just what they do because they're real busy this time of year. But we use the water for irrigation. And what we went through this summer. We've always had to irrigate during July. So here we are with this big traveler. It's like a big sprinkler. Then John can haul to one section of the blueberries. And then we have underground tubing now that he can hook that up to, and then we pump water from the ponds and that gets squirted out. He'll have to tell you how many feet that is. So when the beavers moved in, they built dams to help pond up, they dammed up the water. So I'm like this summer, I'm like, it's a good thing those beavers built those dams for us so that we had more water, I have to admit that they get a little carried away and they went after a beech tree, and I'm like, my favorite trees, we don't do that. But I found out, I went on the DNR website, you mix paint with sand and I painted it all around the base of the tree where they were starting to attack it. It hurts their little teeth. Their big teeth. They don't like sand, so they have not come back. It's still there. And then every year we have to submit water records to the state so that we can say we use this amount of water. Hedgerows and biodiversity, that's another part of regenerative agriculture. And remember in Lewis Brumfield? Well, John came back, divided our farm into like 4 and 5 acre plots, and we planted miles and miles of hedgerows. They serve as windbreaks, beneficial insects, and a little bird's nest there. And they're just, it's really a good aesthetic. And it's the way I look at it. And mostly we used evergreens. We did learn too late, don't plant red pines because, it's the pine bark beetle. So we've lost some of those trees, but so now we just usually use the spruces. And then I have what I call monarch meadow. We've left some places just for the pollinators, and monarch meadow was a sandy hill. And I noticed there were a lot of milkweed popping up there. So we just left it. We don't hay that field anymore. And what I like is, of course, that's where the monarchs are feeding, but they also like those hedgerows. And I didn't realize it until one time I was walking along. There were all these monarchs fluttering around. They were migrating, and they went into the hedgerows for the night. And then the next morning I walked by and there were like 100 monarchs all around me, and they were like exercising their wings before they left to go further south. So it's nice to know that they have a place to go. Here's the most famous field with the hedgerow around it, and that's the poppy field we planted in memory of our son, because again, he was a beekeeper. And so this is for all the pollinators on the farm. And it was a tradition we started with our sons because there were nectar valleys. Well, it wasn't nectar valley, a time when there were no flowers blooming in June. So these flowers bloom in June. I always tell people, you want to see them by the 4th of July. They do go a little longer, but the best is really around Father's Day, the middle of June. So we plant the field, and our original goal was just if other grieving families came to the cemetery, that was giving them something nice to look at. And then came COVID, and then came a TV crew, and then AP picked up the TV feature, and it just played around the nation because I was getting phone calls and texts from, my niece out Washington. Well, I just saw this, like, yeah, you saw it, and there's thousands of people out there right now. Which, in the long run was good. We had a lot of touching notes from like spouses whose, their husband was a PTSD victim. And the most heartbreaking one for me was from a female in Georgia, a veteran from Iraq. And she said, and again, I'm a peer mentor, so I work with people who are suffered from PTSD and have lost somebody from the military. And she said, I've almost taken my life twice. But after reading this, I'm going to go for that Hives for Heroes, and I want to plant flowers. What should I do? And so I told her what she should do, and I encouraged her to get a hive from the Hives from Heroes. And then I said, and here's my phone number. Don't ever do that. Call me if you think you're going to do that. She didn't. She grew the flowers. John just planted them. We made up the mixture. And he just planted them in October. And one time I put it on our Facebook page, and all these people showed up to watch him plant. He goes, what did you do now? Our very first crop is maple syrup. And we do that in mid-February to about the middle of March. I love it because everybody else is going to Florida and I go to the woods. We have lots of friends who like to help us, and that's a great part. That's Ian tasting the sap, and then it's another granddaughter tasting sap. And that's a lot of what kids do when they're out in the woods with you. They taste the sap. So we drill about 400 taps. Some, as you see with Ian, there's now plastic tubing going to buckets. For years, we just did the metal buckets, but we've slowly been changing. And then we go out and collect the sap and bring it back and boil it. It takes about 50 gallons of sap on the average to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. And that's our sugar shed. John does most of the boiling, and we cut a lot of firewood. And then that's our evaporator. So it feeds into the evaporator, slowly makes it down to that final finishing pan where you see that tank. And that's where he strains the syrup because there's very fine sugar sand that comes up. And if you don't do that, you're going to get like an inch of gunk in the bottom of your mason jar. I thought, how do I put the oxen in here? So the oxen, we got a team in 1990s. I used actually some of my first advanced to buy this oxen. And one of my friends said, "Oh, these are literary oxen." And I said, "Yes, they are." So we bought them from Tillers, which is a group down by Kalamazoo who trains draft animals and helps people learn how to train draft animals. They're the bulldozers of the. I remember one time our four-wheel drive tractor couldn't get the tank through a snowdrift. So John unhooked the tractor, got the oxen, and they drove it. They really are the bulldozers, but they recognize the Teamster as the third member of the team. He's a very important member. Sort of like Jesus says, "You'll know my voice." Well, the Teamster, they know his voice and they will obey for him. And one time I came home and there were all these police cars outside my, I'm like, "Oh no, what happened?" John rolled over the Caterpillar. No, they wanted to know if we had these big cows that were in the backyard of the Methodist church, which is on our, that's on part of our farm. I said, I went and got John and he went, "Come on, boys, let's go home." And they went home. Barn raising is a lot of this I talk about, community. We put up a barn and we invited John, if you know Larry and Jane Dickey. Larry Dickey helped us tear down barns, and we designed our barn, and then we put together the beams, mostly on the ground. And then we invited 100 friends. And so John and Larry and I did a lot of the Morrison tenant work. And then everybody put it up. And if you've seen old pictures of barn racing, you see all these guys on it. And I said, absolutely not. I want some women all over here up top. All the women are going to be up there to show that we did this too. What do we do in that barn? We have parties. It's mainly what we do. That's Jack on the Green. If any of you knew Pat Williams and like Lorma Freestone and Ken, that was Lorma's brother Brad. And that we did big revels, like Christmas revels. These were with drama and plays and music and dances and storytelling. And he made a big puppet for me, a Jack on the Green, that came out of the woods. And then we did a maypole that year. Obviously, here's a contra dance going. And then for a couple of years, the Holland Symphony did benefits in our barn. So our rule is clean it up before and clean it up afterwards. And then they also had a silent auction, and they brought it down like a chamber orchestra and had a really wonderful concert. And I put agriculture because one of my friends is a writer in Minneapolis, a well-known author. She said, "John and Joan are agriculture." There's always culture inside what they're doing. What's next? A lot of people go like, "Are you going to retire?" Well, maybe, maybe not for a while. Who knows? About 5 years ago, Carlos and Denisa started their own section called Born and Raised Organics. And they put together this small fruit stand, produce stand. And every year they've expanded a little bit. They do organic strawberries, both you pick and pre-picked, and pumpkins and squash. And people really like their sweet corn. You can see that there in their watermelons. A lot of people like that. And then it's still, it's a family farm. They were all working together. And Carlos has got the kids helping him just because his parents made him help us. And so they're out there working. And then we were planting some new peach trees this spring. And I like the last one because if you don't know, it's a frosty night in April and we're all going, uh-oh, those are frost blankets. So we'll all go out and help unroll those frost blankets and get everything secure down over the berries. And then in the morning after the frost is gone, you have to lift the blankets off. You can't leave them on, or it scorches the plants. So that's like one of the things we do in the springtime, how you have fun in the summer. And then here we all are, the farm crew, the next generation. So there's been a lot of changes, as you can see, especially developing that soil by different methods that we understand now. But then also things that we were doing like the hedgerows, that helps with the biodiversity that we didn't know what we were doing. We're just doing it. And there's a long view of the blueberries. I don't think any of you have picked there. And now it's your time for questions, and John's going to answer any detailed questions. As I said, I'm the storyteller. He's got the questions for farmers. Somebody's got her hand up there.
Are we speechless?
A little off topic, but I love your dress.
Thank you.
So you're also a creative sewer.
Yeah. And so most of our clothes, so some John's clothes. Yeah. The actual dress design, if any of you knew Tasha Tudor, are you familiar with her? Yeah, okay. She was a mentor and friend of mine. And so she was going to give me a pattern, but she never got around to it. So she gave me one of her dresses. And so I just, took it apart and used it to make a dress for myself, and the apron too. So we just came up. It's like we didn't want to, this is before fair trade. We didn't want to be, buying clothes and knowing that there were sweatshops making the clothes. And so we just decided we'd do our own thing. And I remember when my mother, if you knew Ruth Donaldson, she used to come to a lot of these lectures. And when she read the biography about Joan from New England, about Tasha, she goes, "You and that woman are so much alike." And then I met her several years later in Kalamazoo, and she just walked up to me and she said, "You and I need to be friends." And it was amazing. I mean, and John has been out there too. She gave us goats one year. So because I make a lot of cheese and yogurt and that kind of stuff. So I just was immensely blessed to have her as a friend. And then she looked at me once we were studying Spencerian script in Ohio. And she said, we heard a story. She said, "You write that down. We're going to do a book together." I'm like, I don't believe this is happening to me. But we did. She illustrated my first book. And they helped pay for Leon Tolstoy. She liked that too. Because, she lived a very simple, she always said 1830s lifestyle. And it was like a museum going into her house. Like, this is a real Shaker cloak. These are real Shaker boxes, Oh yeah, I was so naive. This teacup I'm washing could be in a museum and it's worth $150, I'm just so, off the grid person from Michigan.
Can you also tell us about your market or how you're open for the public?
Carl's puts out that produce stand when he has produce, and sometimes he has our fruit there. Like we sold our pears and apples there this fall. You can go to our website and contact us through that and send me an email. Like I said, I'd like to pick up a 10-pound box on Friday at 4:00. And then I say, sure, come to the barn, and I give you directions because we have a half-mile driveway. And then you come in, and like I said, some people prefer to pay online. Some people just show up and buy cash. I cannot process credit cards at the farm, either in U-Pick or when you're picking up a box. So we don't have a stand ourselves. Everybody wants to know what are hours. I'm like, well, we're here, we're working all day. And that's why we usually say, well, like 8:30 in the morning, 1:00. So it's right after lunch, or maybe 4:30. But please don't ask us to stop at 2:00 what we're doing. And then, and so we sell our maple syrup only that way too. And I sell maple syrup in my books during U-Pick. So that's the other thing, during U-Pick. Yeah, U-Pick, you can, and then some people come to U-Pick and what we see now is it's more agritainment. Like we want our kids to know how to pick blueberries. So they pick 3 pounds and then they'll buy a 10-pound box.
And your website once more.
Oh, it's Pleasant Hill Blueberry Farm. So yeah, you can go through there, like I said, and you can contact us that. If you want to hear more stories from the farm or other stories, I have a farm newsletter that I send that out usually once a month at the beginning of the month. And so, like I'll tell you, well, the goats just kidded, here are the kids, and we just finished maple syrup. We made 65 gallons and here's everybody on the sap wagon, those kinds of things. And then the other one is an author, but it's called From My Garden. It's like I'm a very avid gardener. And so I usually talk about something to do with gardening and then more from that into something with literature or what's going on. So, if you want that kind of information, they're free. They're on Substack. You can pay, but I don't, why? It's my attitude. The only people who pay are my friends. I'm like, guys, don't have to do this. But Substack is free. And then they always say you're supposed to do something more for the people that pay. And I'm like, I just can't handle anything more. I'm writing novels and running a farm and then managing everything else. So my garden one also talks about all the canning and the preserving and all that kind of stuff that goes on. So, that's why if you want more stories, that's where I write stories for people on Substack. Yeah. Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you for your dedication to create a healthier blueberry.
Well, thank you.
They're my most favorite berries. And
That's
I pick
good. I
them
don't
as a
think myself.
I love them and I think they're great. And I've also been to your barn with the Holland Symphony and it was lovely. So I can give a plus to that. And you mentioned you can get your frozen blueberries at some of the nature stores.
Yeah,
here in
Nature's
town.
Market and Harvest Health.
Okay. Then I have a question kind of off track a little bit since you have lots of techniques to eliminate pest. Do you have a problem with deer in blueberry fields?
You want to talk? You might as well say something about those deer down there breaking the branches.
What was the question? Deer?
Deer, do you have a problem and do you have a trick of getting rid of
Does
them?
does anyone not have a problem? with deer?
Yeah. I know.
Well, we have hunters and we have hunting off season with special stock permits. You can spray various products on the leaves, but it's very expensive.
Very expensive.
Yeah.
And you can't do that during the season, only before. Because it affects the taste of the blueberries. And of course, just like birds, there's many different noise makers and things you can put on. You can run, birds are obviously another problem.
They're a huge problem. Yeah.
And you can, they have falcons that are like drones.
I've looked at it.
$1,500, $2,000 to run a
Yeah.
mechanical falcon. So no, it's usually come out on the short end when it comes to animals. You do better with insect control.
Yeah.
That's hard enough, but with all the squirrels and groundhogs,
Especially in a drought.
deer,
Everybody's looking for juicy fruit.
yeah, especially in a drought, because they need to get water from somewhere. And blueberries just as good a place as any.
Wait.
So
Okay. But you
deer
had to
are
stick
a
a weapon.
problem.
Yeah, and birds, I mean, John always says they eat at least 10 to 15%. You can just see the layer because they're doing all the tops of the bushes. So in a drought like this year, they're all busy eating berries. But, and then the crows go after pears and peaches. They do that too. So, yeah, we have hunters that are on the farm and for that reason. The only real predators, we have coyotes, which also kill cats and your other animals. But they go after the young fawns. So that's sort of a deer control. But if I get my druthers, I get rid of the coyotes personally. But they're down there. They're part of the pattern, I guess, in the long run. So deer are a big problem. And they not only eat the fruit, they break the branches. That's what really John comes home like, they went down this road and they broke that branch. They went down 5 more bushes and they broke another branch. So I'm like, they're doing a lot of damage. Yes.
Other than Leo and Tolstoy, what other animals do you have on the farm?
Well, we had a second team of oxen, Buck and Henry. They died about 15 years ago, right? Yeah. And at this point, we're not having any more oxen. We are rather nostalgic about that. We currently have 3 goats. One's a senior citizen, so we did not breed her this spring. That's Annie. And then Betsy, we need to breed, so she will kid in the spring, which of course freshens her, so we have milk. And then we have a youngster who was born in May, but we don't think we'll breed her because he's not very big. It's like, why? Why not let her have the full year and a half to grow? And she'll, there's no reason to push it. And we got her because Annie is an old goat. And if she were to die, say this winter, because the vet was looking at her going, her arthritis is pretty bad now. Goats cannot be by themselves. They are a herd animal. They have to have a buddy. And so we decided, well, let's get a young goat now. And though it'll take a little while to become friends, that's part of goats, the picking one, but they will become friends. And then we have chickens, and that's all we normally have, other than all the critters running around on the farm. Yeah. Yes.
What's your favorite blueberry recipe?
I don't like blueberries. I make muffins and pancakes. That's what I do. And I eat them because they're good for me. But I much rather eat a blackberry, a peach, a raspberry, a strawberry. So I don't go into the profits. But that kid, his name is Carlos. When he was working on the blueberry shaker, he'd come home and he just blew. And I would like, did you leave us any to sell, And now his kids do it to him, especially strawberries. Oh, that least one, Sophia can eat them out of house and home, but she's aggressive with the cantaloupe too. John was surprised how much cantaloupe, because he can eat he's known as the immoderate melon man for another essay I wrote. So no, I just pancakes and muffins. That's what I make. And I can tell you my muffin recipe if you want, but, and I do put things like that sometimes in my newsletter, you know, just so people know, or cobblers, things like that. Yes.
I was just wondering, the pests that you showed, the two bee-looking nasty things, how did you get rid of those?
The galls or the SWD?
Yeah, the DS,
Oh,
whatever.
SWD?
Yeah,
There's one product, it's $800 a quart, right?
600.
Oh, 600, it went down in price, because it's, and we use how many each time?
So the product is in truss and now you can get another one that's basically the same thing, but yes, $600 a quart. All your organic, well, vegetable sprays are
They're
expensive
expensive
too, but
too.
all the organic sprays are very expensive.
And you use 4 quarts each time you spray, right? Or 3.5?
It's only 5 ounces per acre.
But you can
So a
imagine,
quart does 6 acres, but it's still expensive. It's $100 an acre every time you spray. You can only put 28 ounces per acre over the course of the year.
and that's the only thing we have that we can use for SWD.
So
And again,
it's
there's,
about 6 sprays.
yeah. So, I mean, when you know, as farmers, money comes in, it's not like you get a paycheck every week or every other week or whatever. So you start budgeting. I mean, bees, I think we spent, what, $8,000 this year, $10,000 for bees?
Your bees are about 8,000.
Yeah, it's, so, you know, I mean, that's a big chunk of money that's going out like in June, because, you know, a month after they pollinate, they take the bees and then you pay them. So there's all these things you have to think about. What are you gonna, you need money for this, you need money for that. We've always lived very simply, grow a lot of our own food, which has always been a goal, so that's not a problem. I enjoy most of it. You know, and we raise like meat chickens every other year and those kinds of things. And like I said, we got our own milk, we got our own eggs, and I make a lot of cheese and yogurt. So in that sense, we keep our expenses down if you make all your own clothes. On and on. But it's rough. Again, that's why those beginning farmers can't afford land. What are they supposed to do? You know, I mean, Carl's is just, we saw our parents help us. Now we help our son, you know. And there are some really wonderful farmers like the people with Green Wagon that are making it, and thank God. We need them. We need them very much.
So a while back, you mentioned the two young ladies that wanted to train the goats. So I'm sitting here trying to figure out what you train goats to do.
Oh,
Like song and dance or
even though we had goats to get out one time when we were putting in the foundation for our barn, we could see the goats were watching everything we were doing. And we went away like to a potluck that night. We came home and there are all these little hoof prints. They managed to get out because they are Houdinis. If there's a little hole, they'll get out of the fence. And then we went, oh, bye. But anyways, they were going to train them to pull a cart. That's what most people do, get a goat cart and have a little team. And Tasha had done that and knew people who did that. And I always thought it'd be really cool, but you had to be extremely patient to train any animal. Oxen actually are very smart. I decided they put out that dumb as an ox thing to fool all you people so that you won't try to do anything with them. Because I remember Larry Dickey was trying to train a horse and we put our oxen on a wagon and, you know, they were a little concerned, but about 20 feet, 30 feet later, oh, this isn't going to hurt us. So they went, to, you know, started working. And he couldn't get his horse to pull the wagon or cart that he wanted because he asked us, well, how long did it take you? Like, you know, how many days, how many hours? Of course, John had been training these oxen to have a yoke on, to do everything. It's just they hadn't pulled a sled or a wagon before because it was about 20, 30 feet and they got it. And so oxen are really smart. I mean, you train them like in the woods. We walk them through the woods, stop here because we're going to load sap here, you know, go on to the next spot. And then he'd renew it sort of in the spring so they would remember. And then they also knew that when they stood there, they could close their eyes and take a little nap while we worked. So, you know, and they're, like I said, they're really smart animals. That's why they made up that little saying about being dumb. They're not at all. Smart cows.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I don't remember the term. I'm going to give you a little example and then I think you'll know what I'm talking about and then you can speak to it. We bought property in Langsberg. There were a few apple trees on the front of the yard. It was just a house and a yard. And the first couple of years we were there, the apples were terrible. You wouldn't even want to make cider out of them. They were so bad. But a few years after we'd been living there, we didn't spray or do anything, but the apples were nice and we could eat them. And I asked a friend, what happened? He said, well, look, Jackie, when you moved in, did you have any of these gardens? And I'm a gardener. So I said, no, I put all these gardens. And he said, well, you brought in all these beneficial insects that took care of the bad insects that were ruining your apples. So I know there's a term for that.
I'll let John answer.
John, do you know what I'm talking about? Where you use natural methods, natural, to keep down the pests.
It worked though, didn't it?
It
You
did,
had-
and I'm
You
thinking
had
that's.
beneficial insectary in your
Yeah.
garden, so they went over and took care of the
The-
codling moth larvae.
Yeah, I'm assuming you're doing that naturally because you have so many different things going on your property, right?
Well,
Or
we
are you
have-
doing it
We have a
intentionally?
lot of natural habitat.
Yeah.
But there's no guarantee.
Right, right.
It's just like with the SWD, spotted winged Drosophila. If there's only, like with codling moth or blueberry maggot, where you only have a couple generations a year, it's not so bad, but the spotted winged Drosophila, once they start in the spring,
Yeah.
they're gangbusters. And that's why it's even harder in the fall, like fall raspberries and blackberries. Terrible, but that's WD.
So they're a special nemesis that takes a little bit more.
They're the worst.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're the worst. And like I said, a lot of farmers just gave up. MSU keeps trying, they put up traps every year and monitor what's going on in our bog. And I remember entomology students coming down and doing sweeps to find what was in our farm that was beneficial that they couldn't find. And then maybe John can explain a little more, but we thought nematodes could eat the blueberry maggot larvae. And so the person isn't there anymore at MSU, but he and George Bird went down and they had to do it on an early morning when it rained. So George Bird said, it's going to be raining tomorrow morning. He came over from Lansing and they went and they seeded certain areas with the stuff that was in my refrigerator. Like, what is this stuff? And then looked for it, but couldn't find any of the nematodes. And then I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, there was a PhD student and she was looking at nematodes on our farm and in woods and on the farm next door to us. And I think it took like 15, 20 years, but finally they were finding where these nematodes had multiplied to a point that maybe they could start helping us. So it's like long range plans. Some things just take time.
Okay. You mentioned that it's not something that young farmers are going into, right? We have to encourage young people to do this.
Yeah.
Okay, that raises a little concern for me for the future. Are there big farmers that are doing organic or is it all just smaller farms throughout the country who are putting this product in the stores? Or are there big players too that are doing organic?
There are quite a few large organic farmers. We have 40 acres. At one time, we were one of the largest. I haven't increased over the decades, but there's farmers in North Carolina and Georgia and Northern California and Oregon and Washington that have thousands, hundreds of acres of organic.
But then also most of the berries, depending on the season, are coming from like Peru, Chile, Argentina. They really help wipe out the blueberry markets. I mean, yeah. Well, because I can just think of farmers who are just going out of business. Blueberry farmers are having a really rough time right now because they just can't compete with those international markets. And they're planting them in other places too. I play the ancient wire Irish herb, even though mine came from Scotland. And I was on like a Zoom meeting with harpers from around the world because we're like this little tiny niche. And one of the harpers is from Poland. And she said, I buy blueberries here. I said, where do they come from? What do you call them? Oh, we call them blueberries. And the bushes originally came from us over here, but they planted them in Poland. So she said she can go pick blueberries now too. So, and I think John said in Israel, they're growing blueberries. So they're growing all over in South Africa, right? Yeah, South Africa. So, there's my Harper friend in Poland picking blueberries that the original plants came from over here. And even for us, the original plants, Stanley Johnson, who gave us Red Haven, Hale Haven, all those peaches, he brought in the original blueberry bushes from New Jersey because he said, the soil looks pretty similar in places. And so he thought this would be a good crop for Michigan farmers. And again, my uncle was a farmer down in Pawpaw. And I remember when the next door farm planted some blueberries because we all trekked over there to look at these plants because most of us had never been around high bush blueberries. So, it was very interesting. I don't have any, the only thing I can say is, I think we need like microloans. We need ways maybe they can rent land to own. I can think of friends when they got their farm that they grow rhododendrons on, it was a landmark on contract. So ways to help them have land is going to be the first thing. And then, mentors that are there. We get people calling us all the time. They always call in July. We have questions. We're like, please call us in January, And well, then John will gladly talk to you. And if you've ever been shopping at Oak Haven, Country Life down in Pullman for a while, he was mentoring some people there with their blueberries. So it's like, we're always glad to share. Well, I'm happy to help people. But, the aging of the American farmer at all levels has been written about probably for at least 25 years. And it's not getting better. Let's put it that way. The one thing that I see, and some people may not like it, but many of the migrants who come here and, become citizens and live here, they are planting blueberries. And we can think of some people that, and then our friend Danny Hoffman, what's Danny's last name? Danny, who just died. Danny Hartman. His blueprint, he has a blueberry plantation. He just died, but his wife is running it now along with some Latinos. And he was setting it up he couldn't afford to give them like IRAs, but he planted blueberries for them. So they would inherit that. And they would have a big blueberry farm. And he was converting it all over to organic and regenerative. And John and he were working on some stuff last summer, not this one, the summer before, because Danny died in March from cancer. So I see that they have an extraordinary work ethic. Like this one farmer, he was working for our neighbor. At 3 o'clock, he and his son went home and did all the work on their farm. Their friends were picking at other farms. They quit at 5 o'clock and they'd go pick it till 9 o'clock on their farm. They were picking each other's blueberries. So, it takes an incredible work ethic in order to stay a farmer. It's people like, oh, I hate winter. I love winter. It's, if there's not a lot of snow, we still have work to do, but otherwise, we go cross country skiing, we have potlucks with our friends who are farmers. And there's just, once that daylight savings time kicks in, you're working till 9 o'clock at 9:30 at night. It's just the way it is. So we just really need to encourage those young farmers and encourage them to be fruit farmers too. Fruit farmers around us are turning into housing developments, which I know people need homes, but it's really sad to see good farming land turning into a housing development. There's other land that maybe they could use instead, marginal land. Any other questions? Otherwise, supposedly we're done. It's up to you.
Yeah, we're out of time here, but I think everyone really enjoyed the presentation.
Well,
Thank you to Joan and John.
Thank you for John.
They may stick around for a few minutes if you have any more questions.
We're here.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna turn off the mic though.